and had never seen a human before the day he stepped onto their ship. He had read about them, of course. Every young diplomat in the collective had studied the reports. A new species from a small blue planet, emotionally unstable, physically unremarkable, potentially dangerous, though no one could explain exactly why. The warning had seemed strange to N. His people were peaceful. They had been peaceful for 10,000 years. They had learned long ago that violence solved nothing, that war was a disease of primitive minds. They had evolved beyond such things. They settled disputes with words, with trade, with patient negotiation. The idea of physical conflict made him feel sick. So when the Galactic Council asked him to observe the humans and write a report about them, he accepted the mission with confidence. He would study these creatures, document their strange ways, and recommend whether they should be welcomed into galactic society. It seemed like a simple task. The human ship was called the Starward Hope. It was not beautiful like vessels, which curved like flowing water and hummed with elegant energy fields. The human ship was blocky and gray, covered in hard angles and thick metal plates. It looked like something designed to survive damage rather than avoid it, and found this interesting but did not think much of it at the time. A woman met him at the airlock. She was shorter than N, with dark hair pulled back from her face and calm brown eyes. She smiled when she saw him, and the smile seemed genuine. "You must be our observer," she said. "I'm Morgan, captain of this ship. Welcome aboard." And performed the traditional greeting, touching his chest and bowing his head. "I am honored to be here, Captain. I hope to learn much about your people." Laughed softly. It was a warm sound. "Well, we're pretty boring most of the time, but we'll try to keep things interesting for you." She led him through the ship and began taking mental notes. The corridors were narrow and practical. The walls were painted in dull colors. Everything seemed designed for function rather than comfort, but the humans themselves surprised him. They were everywhere, talking and laughing and working. A group of them sat in a common area playing some kind of game with small cards. Others exercised in a room filled with strange metal equipment. Two young humans argued loudly about something, then suddenly embraced each other and laughed, and did not understand. "Your people seem happy," he said too. She glanced at him with a curious expression. "Why wouldn't we be?" And did not have a good answer. He had expected something different. The reports had made humans sound dangerous, volatile, unpredictable. But these creatures seemed gentle. They reminded him of children in some ways, full of energy and emotion and simple joy. Introduced him to a man named Danny, who worked as an engineer on the ship. Danny was young, with a quick smile and restless hands that were always touching something, adjusting something, fixing something. "So you're here to study us?" Danny asked. "That's kind of weird, but okay. What do you want to know?" "Everything," and said. "Your culture, your history, your way of thinking." Danny scratched his head. "That's a lot. How about we start with dinner? You hungry?" They ate together in the ship's mess hall. The food was strange but not unpleasant. Danny talked about his home, a place called California, where the sun was warm and the ocean was blue. He talked about his mother, who had cried when he left for space. He talked about his dream of one day building a ship of his own, something fast and beautiful that could take him to the edges of the galaxy. And listened and found himself charmed. Danny was so open, so unguarded. He shared his hopes and fears without hesitation, as if and were already a friend rather than a stranger. They were not like this. They were careful with their words, measured in their emotions. Danny's honesty was refreshing. Over the following days, and explored the ship and met more of its crew. There was Chris Tanner, a large man with a face who led the ship's security team. Despite his intimidating appearance, Chris spoke softly and seemed fond of a small plant he kept in his quarters. There was Cole, a young woman who trained constantly in the ship's combat room but spent her free time reading poetry. There was the ship's doctor, an older man named Henry Vance, who told him stories about his and showed him pictures of them on a small screen. None of them seemed dangerous. None of them seemed violent. They were just people living their lives, doing their work, caring about each other. And began to wonder if the Galactic Council had made a mistake. Perhaps the warnings about humans were exaggerated. Perhaps they were based on old information, or misunderstanding, or simple fear of the unknown. These creatures were emotional, yes. They were loud and sometimes chaotic, but they were also kind. They shared their food and their stories. They asked him about his own home and listened with genuine interest. One evening and sat with Morgan on the observation deck, watching the stars drift past. The captain was quiet, her face thoughtful. "What do you think of us so far?" she asked, and considered the question carefully. "I think you are not what I expected." Smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. "We get that a lot. The council believes your species may be dangerous," and admitted. "They worry about your capacity for violence." Did not answer immediately. She stared at the stars for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "We are what we need to be," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." And did not understand what she meant. He made a note to think about it later. That night, he wrote his first report to the collective. He described the humans as warm, social, and emotionally expressive. He noted their attachment to family, their love of stories and games, their easy laughter. He concluded that the concerns about human violence were likely overstated. He was still writing when the alarm began to sound. It was a harsh, screaming noise that filled every corridor of the ship, and dropped his writing pad and stumbled into the hallway, confused and frightened. Danny ran past him, his face suddenly serious. "Stay in your quarters," he called over his shoulder. "We've got trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Ann asked. But Danny was already gone, and somewhere in the distance, and heard Morgan's voice on the ship's communication system, cold and sharp and nothing like the warm woman he had met at the airlock. "All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill." And stood alone in the corridor, his heart's beating fast, and realized that he was about to learn something new about humanity. The ship changed in an instant. One moment it was a place of warmth and laughter. The next moment it was something else entirely, something cold and purposeful and terrifying. And made his way to the command center, ignoring Danny's warning to stay in his quarters. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to see. The command center was filled with humans moving with incredible speed and coordination. They spoke in short, clipped sentences, sharing information without wasting a single word. Screens flickered with data that Ann could not read. Morgan stood at the center of it all, her eyes fixed on the main. She was different now. The warmth was gone from her face. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders straight. She looked like a statue carved from stone, beautiful and terrible and completely without mercy. "Report," she said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Distress signal from mining colony Theta 7, one of her officers replied. "Raiders, 6 ships, they're taking prisoners." And felt his blood turn cold. He knew about everyone in the galaxy knew about they were in species that raided settlements and took prisoners for their slave markets. They were cruel and efficient and utterly without conscience. Most species simply avoided their territory and hoped never to encounter them. "How far?" asked. 40 minutes at maximum speed." Nodded slowly, set course all ahead full. And stepped forward confused. "Captain, surely you will call for reinforcements. They have 6 ships. You are alone." Turned to look at him and took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were not angry. They were not afraid. They were simply empty, like windows into a vast and silent darkness. "There's no time for reinforcements," she said. "Those colonists will be gone in 2 hours, dead or enslaved." She paused. "We're going in." "But you cannot possibly." Sergeant Tanner interrupted, her attention already moving past Ann. "Get your people ready. Standard boarding protocol." Chris Tanner's voice came through the communication system, calm and steady. "Understood, Captain. We'll be ready." And watched in disbelief as the humans prepared for battle. It was not chaotic. It was not frightened. It was methodical, practiced, almost ritualistic. He followed Danny to the crew quarters, where the engineer opened a locker and pulled out a weapon, and recognized it from his research as a kinetic rifle, a device that launched small metal projectiles at incredible speeds. It was primitive compared to technology, but Danny handled it with obvious familiarity. "You're going to fight?" and asked. Danny checked the weapon's mechanism, his movements quick and automatic. "Everyone fights when we need to." "But you are an engineer." Danny looked at him, and there was something new in his eyes, something hard that had not been there before. "I'm a human first, engineer second." All over the ship, and saw similar scenes. The people who had laughed and played games and told stories about their families were now checking weapons, testing armor, reviewing tactical information on portable screens. They moved without panic, without hesitation. They had done this before. And made his way to the cargo bay, where Chris Tanner was gathering his squad of Marines. They were a fearsome sight, dressed in heavy armor painted with symbols and images. Skulls, flames, words in human languages that he could not read. Some of the Marines had painted their faces as well, dark lines under their eyes and across their cheeks. "What are those markings?" and asked Cole, who was fastening her armor with practiced hands. She glanced at him. "War paint, old tradition, helps us focus." "Focus on what?" Smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator. "On what we're about to do." Chris Tanner gathered his people in a circle. He was calm, almost serene, his face peaceful, but his eyes were alive with something that made Anne's skin crawl. "Listen up," Chris said. "Raiders, 6 ships, maybe 200 hostiles total, civilians in cages, you know the drill. We go in fast, we hit hard, we get those people out. No prisoners, no mercy. Anyone hesitates, people die. Understood?" The Marines responded as one, a sound that was not quite a word, more like a growl that came from deep in their chests. Chris nodded. "Good. Check your gear, say your prayers, and get ready to drop. We launch in 30 minutes." The squad dispersed, and Anne found himself standing beside Chris. The big man was checking his own weapon, a larger and more powerful rifle than the others carried. "You should go back to your quarters," Chris said without looking up. "This isn't going to be pretty." "I need to observe," and replied, "It is my mission." Chris finally looked at him, and there was something like pity in his eyes. "Then observe, but don't get in the way, and don't expect us to be gentle." "I don't understand," and said. "You were so different before, all of you, you seemed so kind." Chris was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We are kind, that's why we're doing this." "I do not see the connection." The sergeant sighed like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "Those colonists are strangers. We've never met them. They're not our people, not our responsibility, but they're in trouble and we can help. So we're going to help. That's what kindness looks like when the universe gets ugly." "But you will kill the—" "Yes." Without hesitation, without remorse. Chris met his eyes. "The enslaved children, they work them to death in mines and factories. They breed them like animals. We've seen what they do. We've seen the bodies." His voice was steady, but there was an old anger beneath it, something that had been burning for a long time. "So yes, without hesitation, without remorse." And did not know what to say. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the command center showed the mining colony. It was a small installation on an airless moon, surrounded by 6 angular vessels. Smaller ships were moving between the vessels and the colony, carrying prisoners. Morgan's voice filled the ship. "All stations report ready, weapons hot, Marines standing by." A pause. "For those colonists down there, for their families, for everyone they have ever hurt, let's end this." The starward hope surged forward, and felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet as the weapon systems came online. He looked around at the humans, at their hard faces and ready weapons, at the terrible purpose in their eyes. These were the same people who had shared meals with him, told him jokes, shown him pictures of their children. And now they were going to war. And realized with a cold certainty that settled into his bones that he had completely misjudged this species. He had thought they were gentle because they were incapable of violence. He had been wrong. They were gentle because they chose to be, and now they were choosing something else. The first ship exploded on them, and the humans did not cheer. They simply moved to the next target, their faces calm, their hands steady, their eyes empty of everything except the work that needed to be done. And began to understand what true horror looked like. The battle was nothing like it had imagined. In his mind, combat was chaos. It was screaming and confusion and blind panic. It was what happened when civilized beings lost control of themselves. This was different. This was precise. This was beautiful in a way that made him want to vomit. The starward Hope moved through the formation like a knife through water. Its weapons fired in careful patterns, each shot tearing into specific points on the enemy vessels, and watched the tactical display and realized that the humans were not simply shooting at the ships. They were disabling them, targeting engines and weapons and shields with surgical accuracy. First target neutralized, one of the bridge officers announced. Second target engines offline, third target shields failing. Morgan nodded, her face expressionless. Launch boarding parties, targets 2 and 4. Small craft detached from the starward Hope and raced toward the damaged vessels, and knew that Chris Tanner and his Marines were aboard those craft, ready to board the enemy ships and fight their way through. He asked permission to watch the combat feeds, hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Show him," she said to her communications officer. "Let him see what we are." The screen in front of him flickered to life, showing multiple camera views from the Marines' helmets. He saw the inside of the boarding craft, crowded with armored humans checking their weapons one final time. No one spoke. They did not need to. They had trained for this 1,000 times. The craft hit the ship's hull with a grinding impact, and heard the scream of cutting tools as the humans burned through the enemy's armor. Then the hull gave way, and the Marines poured through the opening like water through a broken dam. They were waiting for them. The creatures were larger than humans, with hard shells and multiple limbs ending in sharp claws. They clicked and hissed in their strange language, raising their own weapons to defend their ship. It did not matter. Chris Tanner was the first through the breach. He moved with impossible speed for such a large man, his rifle firing in controlled bursts. Each burst found its target. Each target fell. He did not pause, did not hesitate, did not waste a single motion. He was a machine built for one purpose, and that purpose was death. Behind him came the other Marines, spreading out through the corridor in practiced formations. They covered angles, checked corners, communicated with hand signals and short words. They came at them in waves, and each wave broke against the human advance. And watched a warrior charge at Cole, its claws raised to strike. She was smaller than the creature, weaker, slower. By any logical measure, she should have died in that moment. Instead, she stepped to the side at the last instant, letting this momentum carry it past her. Her rifle came up, pressed against the back of the creature's head, and fired once. The dropped and did not move again, was already turning to the next target before the body hit the floor. The humans pushed deeper into the ship, leaving dead behind them like a trail of broken shells. They did not stop to celebrate their kills. They did not taunt their enemies. They simply moved forward, step by step, room by room, until they reached the cargo hold. There were cages there filled with colonists from the mining settlement. Men, women, children huddled together in terror. They screamed when they saw the armored figures approaching, thinking that more had come to hurt them. Then they saw the human faces beneath the helmets, and they began to weep with relief. Chris Tanner spoke to them in a gentle voice that seemed impossible coming from a man covered in the blood of his enemies. "You're safe now," he said. "We're going to get you out of here. Just stay calm and follow my people." On the second ship, another squad was doing the same thing, and switched between camera feeds watching the humans work. They were methodical and efficient. They killed without passion but also without cruelty. They took no pleasure in the violence, but they did not shrink from it either. One of the Marines took a hit from a weapon. He stumbled, his armor scorched, but he did not fall. The Marine beside him covered him while he regained his balance, then both of them continued forward. And saw Cole take a wound to her arm. A blade had found a gap in her armor, cutting deep into the flesh. Blood ran down her gauntlet and dripped onto the floor. She looked at the wound for perhaps 2 seconds, then tore a strip of fabric from her belt and tied it tight around her arm. She switched her rifle to her other hand and kept fighting. How is this possible? And wondered. How can they continue when they are hurt? How can they function through the pain? He asked Danny, who had stayed on the Starboard Hope to help coordinate the boarding operations. Danny glanced at the feed showing fighting with one arm and shrugged. "Adrenaline helps," he said. "Training helps more. When you've done something 1,000 times, you don't have to think about it. Your body just knows what to do. But the pain, she'll feel it later. Right now there are people who need her. The pain can wait." And stared at the human, trying to understand. "This is normal for your species." Danny's expression was complicated, a mixture of pride and sadness. "It's what we do when we have to. It's not who we are, it's what we can become." The battle ended. The ships were either destroyed or captured. Their crews were dead, killed to the last individual. The humans had taken no prisoners, shown no mercy. And yet, when the firing stopped, they immediately turned their attention to the colonists they had rescued. And watched Chris Tanner carry a child out of a cage. The little girl was crying, her face dirty with tears and fear. Chris held her against his armored chest and whispered words that he could not hear, and slowly, the child's crying faded. She put her small arms around the soldier's neck and held on tight. The same hands that had killed dozens of warriors now cradled a frightened child with impossible tenderness. The same man who had shown no mercy to his enemies was now weeping quietly, tears running down his face, because a little girl had trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms. And sat back from the monitor, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. They had always believed that violence corrupted the soul. They believed that those who killed became killers, that blood stained the spirit forever, that there was no coming back from the darkness of war. It was why they had abandoned violence 10,000 years ago. It was why they considered themselves civilized and considered species like the to-be beasts. But these humans had killed without becoming monsters. They had waded through blood and death, and then they had immediately begun healing and helping and caring. They were soldiers and nurses, killers and comforters, all at the same time. It should have been impossible. It should have driven them mad. And yet they seemed, if anything, more gentle after the battle than before it, as if the violence had reminded them how precious peace was. Danny sat down beside him. The engineer looked tired, his face pale, but his eyes were calm. "You okay?" Danny asked, and shook his head. "I do not know what I just saw." "You saw humans fighting," Danny said quietly. "And now you're going to see humans healing. Both are true, both are us." He paused. "It's a lot to take in, I know, but this is what we are. We don't hide from it. We don't pretend to be something else." And looked at the young engineer, at his kind eyes and his steady hands and his gentle voice. And he felt, for the first time in his life, truly afraid. Not of what humans might do to him, but of what they were capable of doing to anyone who threatened the things they loved. The aftermath was quiet. The guns had stopped firing. The screaming had stopped. The ships drifted in space, dark and empty, their crews nothing but corpses scattered across bloody corridors. The Starboard Hope had won. An expected celebration. He expected the humans to cheer and laugh and congratulate each other on their victory. That was what warriors did in the stories of his people, the ancient tales from before the abandoned violence. Winners celebrated. It was natural. But the humans did not celebrate. They moved through the ship in silence, their faces blank. Some of them were helping the rescued colonists, providing food and blankets and medical care. Others were cleaning their weapons, storing their armor, returning to their normal duties. A few simply sat alone, staring at nothing. And found Danny in the engineering section. The young man was running diagnostics on the ship systems, his fingers moving over the controls automatically. But his eyes were distant, focused on something far away. "Danny," and said softly. Danny blinked and looked at him. "Hey, sorry, just processing." "Processing what?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I killed 4 today, watched them die, heard them making those clicking sounds they make when they're hurt." He swallowed hard. "It doesn't get easier. You'd think it would, but it doesn't." And did not know what to say. In his culture, speaking of violence was considered shameful. You did not discuss such things openly, but Danny seemed to need to talk, so and listened. "The first time I killed someone, I threw up afterward," Danny continued. "Couldn't stop shaking for hours, had nightmares for months, and everyone told me it was normal, that it meant I was still human." He let out a bitter laugh. "Isn't that strange? That feeling sick about killing is what makes us human." And made his way to the medical bay, where Dr. Henry Vance was treating the wounded. The old man looked exhausted, his white coat stained with blood, both human and. But his hands were steady as he worked, stitching cuts and setting bones and whispering reassurances to his patients. Cole sat on one of the beds, her wounded arm being treated by a medical assistant. She had refused stronger medication, asking only for something to dull the sharpest edge of the pain. When an asked her why, she nodded toward a group of colonists being treated nearby. "They need it more than I do," she said simply. "Some of those kids haven't eaten in days. They're dehydrated, malnourished, traumatized. I just got a cut. I'll survive." Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost casual, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the way she held herself stiffly to avoid moving her arm. She was suffering, and she was choosing to suffer more so that others could suffer less. He found Chris Tanner in the cargo bay, sitting alone in a corner. The big sergeant had removed his armor and cleaned the blood from his skin, but he still wore the same distant expression that I had seen on so many human faces today. And approached slowly, not wanting to intrude, but Chris looked up and gestured for him to sit. "You're probably confused," Chris said. "I am," and admitted. "I thought, after a battle like that, you would be proud, triumphant." Chris shook his head slowly. "We lost 2 people today, Martinez and good soldiers, good friends." His voice caught slightly. "Martinez had a daughter back on Earth, 3 years old. She's never going to see her father again." He held up his hands, turning them over and staring at them like they belonged to someone else. "These hands killed a lot of today. 30, maybe 40, I don't know exactly. I stopped counting a long time ago." He closed his hands into fists. "Every one of them is going to stay with me. Every face, every sound, every moment. I'm going to carry them for the rest of my life." "Then why do you do it?" and asked. "Why fight at all if the cost is so high?" Chris looked at him with tired eyes. "Because someone has to. Because those colonists were going to die or worse if no one helped them. Because the universe is full of creatures like and someone has to stand against them." He paused. "We do it because we're the only ones who can." "But other species—" "Other species walk away," Chris interrupted. "They avoid conflict. They protect themselves. They let the take whoever they want as long as it's not them." His jaw tightened. "Humans don't walk away. We can't. It's not in our nature." And thought about this for a long time. He thought about his own species, who had built a civilization based on avoiding conflict at any cost. They were peaceful, yes. They were sophisticated. But when they came to their borders, simply moved. They surrendered territory rather than fight. They paid tribute rather than resist. They had called it wisdom. They had called it evolution. But sitting here, looking at Chris Tanner's haunted eyes and blood-stained hands, and wondered if it was simply cowardice. He found Morgan in her quarters, standing at the window and watching the stars. She did not turn when he entered, but she knew he was there. "My first command," she said quietly. "I lost half my crew in a single engagement, 37 people. I knew all their names. I had dinner with them, played cards with them, listened to their stories about home." She placed one hand against the glass. "I still see their faces when I close my eyes." "How do you continue?" Anne asked. "How do you accept command again, knowing what it might cost?" Turned to face him, and saw that her eyes were red. She had been crying, this woman who had commanded the battle with such cold efficiency. She had been weeping alone in her quarters while her crew thought she was made of stone. "I continue because they need me to continue," she said. "My crew, the people we protect, they need someone willing to make the hard choices, to carry the weight, to do what has to be done." She smiled sadly. "It breaks something inside you every time, a little piece of your soul that never comes back, but you keep going because the alternative is letting evil win." And finally understood. This was the true horror of humanity, not their capacity for violence, not their skill at killing, not even their willingness to fight against terrible odds. The horror was that they felt everything. They were not desensitized. They were not numb. Every death affected them, every battle them, every act of violence cost them something precious. They did not enjoy killing. They did not crave war. They were gentle creatures who had learned to do terrible things because the universe demanded it. And they kept doing it anyway. They had abandoned violence because they could not bear its weight. They had evolved away from conflict because the psychological cost was too high. They had chosen peace because war hurt too much. Humans felt the same pain, and could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices, feel it in the heavy silence that filled their ship. They suffered just as deeply as they would have suffered. But they did not stop. They did not retreat. They did not evolve away from conflict or choose peace at any price. They picked up their weapons, knowing they would be traumatized. They walked into battle, knowing they might never recover. They killed their enemies, knowing that each kill would haunt them forever. And then they went home and hugged their children and cried in the dark and woke up screaming from nightmares, and did it all over again, the next time someone needed help. That was the moment and discovered true horror. Not the horror of human violence, but the horror of human sacrifice. The horror of beings who would break themselves, shatter their own souls, destroy their own peace of mind, all to protect strangers they had never met. He sat alone in his quarters that night, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly, unable to process what he had learned. The humans were not monsters, they were martyrs. And that was far, far more terrifying. The council chamber was vast and ancient, carved from the living crystal of the light filtered through translucent walls, casting rainbow patterns across the floor. Representatives from 12 different species sat in tiered circles, their attention focused on the small figure standing at the center of the room. And had never felt so small. He had never felt so uncertain. In his hands, he held the report that would determine humanity's fate in the galactic community. Months of observation, weeks of writing, and now this moment of judgment. The high speaker of the collective raised one slender hand, and silence fell across the chamber. "Observer N," she said, her voice echoing in the crystal space, "you were sent to assess the human species, to determine whether they should be welcomed as partners or contained as a threat. The council awaits your findings." And looked around at the gathered representatives. He saw the tall and elegant masters of diplomacy and trade. He saw the sturdy and cautious builders of great works. He saw the quick and nervous, always calculating risk and reward. Each species had evolved its own approach to survival. Each had found its own balance between conflict and cooperation. None of them were prepared for what he was about to tell them. Honored representatives, and began, I have spent many months among the humans. I have eaten their food, learned their customs, heard their stories. I have watched them in peace, and I have watched them in war. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And I must tell you that everything we believed about them was wrong. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The high speaker raised her hand again, restoring silence. "Explain," she said, and took a deep breath. "The humans are not conquerors. They do not seek war or glory or territory. They are, at their core, a gentle species. They love their families. They tell jokes and play games. They show kindness to strangers. When I first met them, I thought the Council's concerns were foolish. I thought they were harmless." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. Not because they are dangerous in the way we feared, but because they are dangerous in a way we never imagined." The representative leaned forward. "Speak plainly, observer. What is the nature of this danger?" And thought about Morgan, weeping alone in her quarters after commanding a battle with cold efficiency. He thought about Chris Tanner, carrying a sleeping child while his hands still bore the marks of killing. He thought about Danny, describing the nightmares that followed every violent encounter. "The danger," he said, "is that humans will bear any cost to protect those they have chosen to defend. They are not limited by self-preservation. They are not discouraged by trauma. They feel the full weight of violence, the full horror of war, and they do it anyway, because they believe it is right." He told them about the battle with the raiders. He described the efficiency of the human warriors, their coordination, their refusal to stop even when wounded. He described the aftermath, the grief and the guilt and the nightmares that followed. "They do not celebrate their victories," he said. "They mourn them. Every life they take costs them something. Every battle leaves scars that never fully heal. And yet when the next call comes, when the next innocent needs protection, they will answer, without hesitation, without reservation. They will break themselves again and again for the sake of strangers they have never met." The chamber was silent, and could feel the weight of attention pressing down on him from every direction. "I watched their captain, Morgan, order an attack on 6 enemy vessels with only 1 ship under her command. She knew that people would die. She knew that she might die. But there were civilians in danger, children in cages, and she would not abandon them. She would not calculate the odds and walk away. She simply could not." He looked around at the representatives, meeting their eyes one by one. "My people, the abandoned violence because we could not bear its psychological cost. We evolved away from conflict because it hurt too much. We believed this made us superior, more civilized, more advanced." His voice dropped. "But now I understand that we simply chose the easier path. We chose to protect ourselves rather than others. We chose comfort over sacrifice. Humans made a different choice. They chose to carry the weight. They chose to suffer so that others would not have to. They chose to be broken rather than to be bystanders." He shook his head. "I do not know if that makes them more evolved or less, but I know that it makes them extraordinary." The representative spoke, her voice deep and rumbling. "You speak of their virtues, but what of their danger? Should we fear an attack from these humans?" And considered the question carefully. "If you do not threaten humanity, you have nothing to fear. They are not expansionist. They do not seek to conquer or dominate. They want only to live in peace, to explore, to build, to grow." He paused. "But if you threaten those under their protection, if you harm the innocent, if you prey upon the weak, then yes, you should fear them." His voice grew stronger. "Because they will come for you, not with anger, not with hatred, but with cold and terrible purpose. They will come for you no matter how many ships you have, no matter how strong your defenses, no matter how far you run. They will keep coming until the threat is ended, and they will accept whatever cost is required, whatever pain, whatever loss, whatever sacrifice." He thought of Cole, refusing pain medication so that injured colonists could have it instead. He thought of the 2 soldiers who had died in the battle, whose families would never see them again. Do not test them, and said quietly. Do not force them to show you what they can become, because they will show you, and you will not like what you see. The High Speaker studied him for a long moment. What is your recommendation, observer? Should humanity be welcomed into the galactic community or contained? And did not hesitate, welcomed without reservation as partners and allies and friends. He smiled slightly. Because I have seen what happens to their enemies, and I would much rather be their friend. A long silence followed. Then the representative spoke again. And if they turn on us someday, if their nature leads them to expand, to conquer, to dominate as other young species have done. And thought about the question. He thought about everything he had learned about humans, everything he had seen them do, and he answered honestly. They will not, I am certain of this, because their greatest strength is not their capacity for violence. It is their capacity for compassion. They fight because they care. They kill because they love. Take away the things they love and you have nothing to fear. But so long as there are innocents to protect, so long as there are weak to defend, so long as there is evil to resist, the humans will stand against it. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the High Speaker. They are not monsters, they are guardians, and the galaxy needs guardians, especially now, especially with species like the still preying on the vulnerable. He took a deep breath. Welcome the humans, embrace them, learn from them, because whether we like it or not, they are going to change everything. The vote was taken. The representatives consulted, debated, considered, and when the final tally was announced, it was unanimous. Humanity was welcomed into the galactic community. And watched the result displayed on the crystal walls of the chamber, and he felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, hope, fear. He thought about Danny, who dreamed of building a ship that could reach the edges of the galaxy. He thought about Morgan, who carried the weight of command with grace and quiet suffering. He thought about Chris Tanner, whose hands could kill without mercy and comfort without hesitation. The humans were coming, not as conquerors, not as threats, but as something far more complicated and far more wonderful. And N, who had gone to study them as an observer, found himself hopping that someday when he needed help, when he needed protection, when the darkness of the galaxy threatened to overwhelm him. A human would be there. Because he had seen what humans could do. He had seen their violence and their compassion, their fury and their tenderness, their terrible capacity for destruction and their infinite capacity for love. And he had learned that the most terrifying thing in the universe was not a species that could fight. It was a species that would fight, despite the cost, despite the pain, despite everything, for the sake of those who could not fight for themselves. That was humanity. That was their gift to the galaxy. That was the true horror and the true hope that it had discovered among the stars.